They fined me $500 for hunting next to my own lake cabin. Then someone called the cops, told me the water wasn't mine, told me the forest I'd hiked since I was 10 was part of some community reserve. I thought it was a joke until a pink citation showed up on my door with bylaws I'd never seen and a name I'd never heard. That's when things stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like a setup. I didn't plan to fight back, but once I found what my uncle left behind, well, let's just say things got interesting. Let me know what you'd have done in my boots. I inherited my Uncle Arthur's lake cabin 3 years ago. The peaceful mornings with the mist rising off the water made me feel like I had escaped everything. The noise, the deadlines, the city. This was my sanctuary. Picture this. A small wooden cabin sitting on the edge of a crystal clear lake surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to stretch up forever. The morning mist would roll off the water like something out of a painting, and the only sounds were loons calling across the lake, and maybe the occasional splash of a fish jumping. The weekends spent here were sacred. The cabin passed down from Uncle Arthur held memories of my youth. My grandfather's stories, the fishing trips, the simple joy of silence. This land wasn't just property, it was family history and peace in its purest form. I'm a professional hunter, so this wasn't just a vacation spot for me. This was paradise. Every weekend I could manage, I'd drive the 2 hours from my day job in the city to spend time in what felt like my own private wilderness. I mean, when you make your living tracking game and understanding animal behavior, finding a place like this feels like winning the lottery. That particular Friday morning in October, I was sitting on my wooden dock with a cup of coffee watching the sun come up over the tree line. The air was crisp, perfect hunting weather, and I could already see deer tracks along the muddy shoreline. I'd been planning this hunting trip for weeks, and everything felt right. My rifle was cleaned and ready, my permits were all current, and I had the whole weekend ahead of me. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have this place, this perfect slice of nature, but something told me that peace wouldn't last forever. The world had a way of intruding, and I could feel it creeping closer. I spent that morning following the established trails through my forest. These weren't random paths. These were trails that had been used for decades, probably since before the cabin was even built. The hunting was good, really good. I managed to track a decent-sized buck through the thick underbrush, and by noon, I had what I needed. It felt like the kind of successful hunt that reminds you why you love being outdoors in the first place. The forest was quiet except for the sound of my boots on the fallen leaves, and I felt that deep satisfaction that comes from doing something you're genuinely good at. I wasn't bothering anyone, wasn't making excessive noise, just enjoying my own property the way it was meant to be enjoyed. As a professional hunter, I know the importance of respecting the land and the animals, and this felt like the perfect balance between my passion and my responsibility. The ancient trees seemed to approve of my presence, their branches swaying gently in the autumn breeze. Every step I took felt natural, like I belonged here in this wilderness that my family had protected for generations. As I walked back to the cabin, a strange feeling gnawed at me. Then I saw it. A bright pink piece of paper fluttering in the wind taped to my door. My heart sank. No one in their right mind would leave something like that for no reason. The paper was fluttering in the breeze, and from 20 feet away, I could tell someone had used Comic Sans font for whatever message they wanted to leave me. I pulled the paper off my door and read it, and I swear I had to read it 3 times before it sank in. Use of firearms disturbs community peace. Stop immediately. Signed HOA Lakeside Vistas. I stood there staring at this thing, wondering if someone was playing a practical joke on me. Neon pink paper, Comic Sans font. Was this supposed to be official? I mean, seriously, who uses Comic Sans for legal documents? It looked like something a kid would make for a school project. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but something about the authoritative tone made my stomach twist with unease. While I was cleaning my hunting gear later that afternoon, I decided to poke around in some of the old storage boxes my uncle had left behind. Most of it was the usual stuff you'd expect. Old fishing magazines, rusty tackle boxes, receipts for property taxes going back years. But buried in one of the boxes, I found something that made me stop and think. As I rifled through the boxes, something caught my eye. A letter from Uncle Arthur. It was old, yellowed, and signed in his unmistakable handwriting. One line stood out. Never let them control this lake. At the time, I figured it was just my uncle being stubborn about something. Arthur was always a bit of a loner, and I thought maybe he'd had some dispute with the neighbors about fishing rights or boat access. I didn't grasp the significance of that letter, not yet anyway. But something about the way he'd underlined those words made me think there was more to the story. The ink had faded over the years, but his determination seemed to leap off the page as if he'd known this moment would come. Around 4:30, I was loading my hunting rifle back into my truck when I heard the whir of an electric motor coming up the gravel road. A pristine white golf cart appeared around the bend, and behind the wheel was a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a country club brochure. Perfectly styled blonde hair, pressed khaki outfit, and the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. She stopped her golf cart right in front of my truck, staring at me like a judge passing sentence. She didn't even get out. "You're disturbing the peace, and I won't let that go unnoticed," she called out, her voice dripping with authority. Did she really just say that to me? I mean, I've been hunting professionally for over a decade, and some suburban HOA queen is lecturing me about peace, I told her. "This is my property. I have the proper permits. You have no right to stop me." But she only smirked, almost as if my words were an inconvenience to her. She pointed at my rifle case and said, "Property ownership doesn't mean you can endanger our community with firearms, Hunter." The way she said that last word like it was something dirty. Her condescension made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. But here's where it gets interesting. She never got out of that golf cart, never introduced herself, never even pretended this was a friendly neighbor visit. She just sat there like she was royalty addressing a peasant. "I'm Diane, by the way, president of the Lakeside Vistas Homeowners Association. And you are..." When I told her my name was Logan and that I owned this property fair and square, she actually laughed. Not a friendly laugh, but that cold, calculating sound that people make when they think they know something you don't. Her confidence was unsettling, like she held cards I couldn't see. "Well, Logan owning property in our community comes with responsibilities. Responsibilities you clearly don't understand yet." The confidence in her voice made my skin crawl, like she had some kind of ace up her sleeve that I couldn't see. She pulled out a thick folder, its contents probably full of bylaws and threats, and waved it in my face. "You're violating community rules. If you don't comply, we'll have no choice but to take legal action." The folder looked official, intimidating, like she'd done this before. But something about her theatrics felt rehearsed, practiced. But as she drove off, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about community rules. This was personal, and somehow she had picked the wrong person to mess with. I didn't know it then, but my uncle had left me more than just a cabin. The land and the lake were mine to protect. This was bigger than I thought. As her golf cart disappeared around the bend with that annoying electric whir, I realized this wasn't just about noise complaints. The pink paper, the official sounding language, the way she'd positioned herself like she had some kind of authority over me. But I had no idea how deep this rabbit hole would go, or that this woman was about to turn my peaceful hunting retreat into a legal battlefield that would reveal secrets about my property that even I didn't know existed. The next morning, I woke up determined to ignore yesterday's weirdness and focus on why I'd come here in the first place. The sun was just starting to filter through the pine trees, and the forest looked absolutely perfect for hunting. I made myself a quick breakfast, checked my gear one more time, and headed out into the deeper parts of the woods. These trails wound through some of the most beautiful hunting territory I'd ever seen. Dense forests that opened into small clearings, natural water sources, where animals would come to drink, and the kind of silence that makes you remember what peace actually feels like. I'd spent weeks planning this hunt the perfect escape, but as I tracked the deer, an unsettling feeling crept over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this weekend wasn't going to end the way I expected. I was hoping that if I just stayed deep in the forest, away from whatever community this Diane woman thought she was protecting, I could enjoy my weekend without any more drama. Looking back, I probably should have known better. When someone like that gets their teeth into something, they don't just let it go. The morning air was crisp and clean, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. I was wrong about that peaceful morning. Around 10 a.m., I heard something that definitely didn't belong in the middle of my forest. Car doors slamming, and then the sound of boots on the trail behind me. Heavy boots moving with purpose. I turned around and saw a police officer making his way through the trees following the trail I'd just walked. My stomach immediately tightened, because, let's be honest, even when you know you're not doing anything wrong, seeing a cop in the middle of nowhere makes you nervous. My paperwork was perfect, but something about uniforms always made my stomach tighten. The officer was a big guy, probably in his 40s, with the kind of professional demeanor that comes from years of dealing with people's problems. He approached me calmly, introduced himself as Officer Henderson, and asked to see my hunting license and permits. My paperwork was perfect, of course. I'm a professional hunter, so keeping my licenses current isn't just a hobby thing for me, it's literally part of my job. But there's something about having to prove you're not breaking the law that always makes your hands shake a little. You know? The autumn sun filtered through the trees as Henderson examined each document with the thoroughness of someone who knew what he was looking at. Officer Henderson reviewed everything thoroughly, checking the dates, comparing my license photo to my face, even looking at the serial numbers on my rifle. But he did it all respectfully, like someone who understood what he was looking at. After a few minutes, he handed everything back to me with what looked like genuine respect. "You're the professional hunter who bought Arthur's old place," he said, and his voice carried warmth when he mentioned my uncle. "He used to tell me this was the best hunting land in the county. Said you city folks wouldn't understand what real hunting was about, but I can see you're not just some weekend warrior." His words carried the weight of genuine approval. That comment hit me in a way I wasn't expecting. Henderson knew my uncle respected what I did for a living, and actually seemed relieved that Arthur's land had gone to someone who understood its value. But then I noticed we weren't alone. Parked at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards away, was that same white golf cart from yesterday. Diane was behind the wheel, but this time she wasn't bothering with face-to-face confrontation. Instead, she was talking on her cell phone, and I could hear her voice carrying through the quiet forest air like she was performing for an audience. Her theatrical complaints echoed through the morning stillness. She had her phone on speaker, and she was practically performing for an audience. "Officer Henderson, this is the individual I reported for repeated safety violations. You can see he's armed and has been discharging firearms in violation of community peace ordinances." She stayed in her golf cart while she said this, like she was directing military operations from a command center. I watched Officer Henderson glance in her direction, and I swear I saw more than just amusement cross his face. There was something that looked almost like annoyance, like he'd been dragged out here for something he knew was ridiculous. The contrast between his professionalism and her dramatics was almost comical. Henderson looked at my permits one more time, then back toward Diane's golf cart, then back at me. "Everything here is completely legal," he said loud enough for Diane to hear. "Professional hunting license, proper permits, private property. You're good to go." He tipped his hat and started walking back toward his patrol car, but not before giving me a look that said he understood exactly what was happening here. His expression conveyed a mixture of professional courtesy and personal understanding that made me feel like I had an ally in this bizarre situation. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and autumn leaves as justice prevailed, but Diane wasn't finished with her performance. From her golf cart, she called out, "Officer Henderson, surely there are noise ordinances that apply even on private property. This kind of activity sets a dangerous precedent for our community." Henderson stopped walking and turned back toward her cart with the kind of patience that suggested he'd dealt with difficult people before. "Ma'am, hunting on private property with proper permits is completely legal. There are no violations here." His tone was professional but firm, like he was explaining something to a child who kept asking the same question. The authority in his voice left no room for argument. Just as Henderson was about to disappear through the trees, Diane finally abandoned her golf cart and marched over on foot. Her perfectly styled hair was starting to come loose from the humidity, and her pressed khaki outfit was getting wrinkled from the walk through the underbrush. "Enjoy your little victory," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "The HOA board has tools you haven't seen yet. We've dealt with difficult property owners before, and we know how to protect our community values." The way she said it with her fists clenched at her sides and her face flushed red made it clear this wasn't just about community safety anymore. Her mask of civility was beginning to slip. But what really got to me was what she said next. "You hunters think you can just do whatever you want because you have some papers from the state. But this community was built on certain principles, and we don't intend to let outsiders change the character of our neighborhood." There was something in the way she said outsiders that made my skin crawl. I mean, I owned property here just like everyone else, but somehow I was still an outsider. Her words carried undertones of prejudice that went deeper than simple neighborhood disputes. The venom in her voice suggested this was about more than hunting regulations. Maybe I was reading too much into it, but her whole attitude suggested that people like me, professional hunters who actually use the land for what it was meant for, didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should be. She pulled out her phone again and started typing furiously, muttering something about documenting everything and escalating this matter to the proper authorities. Walking back to my cabin that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Her words carried a different weight this time. Not just anger, but something calculated and planned. What exactly did she mean by tools, and why did I get the feeling that this was just the beginning of whatever game she was playing? I got back to my cabin around 3 that afternoon, thinking maybe Diane would back off after Henderson shut her down. I should have known better. When people like that taste blood in the water, they don't just swim away. They circle back with bigger teeth. A thick manila envelope was wedged into my doorframe like someone had tried to force it through the wood itself. The return address read, Lakeside Vista's HOA Legal Department, in fancy lettering that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Inside was what looked like a legitimate legal document printed on letterhead that screamed expensive lawyer. I stared at the pink paper heart, pounding, not believing my eyes. Use of firearms disturbs community peace. This was a joke, right? My blood boiled. This wasn't a fine. It was a threat. Disturbing community peace with firearms was listed as a Class A violation, punishable by a $500 fine payable within 14 days to avoid further legal action. The whole thing was designed to intimidate with legal terminology that would probably scare most people into paying up without question. But here's where it gets really interesting. Within hours of finding that fake fine, I started getting forwarded emails from neighbors I'd never even met. The subject line was always the same: safety concern in our community. Diane had sent a scanned copy of the violation notice to every person on the HOA mailing list, painting me as a dangerous threat to the entire community, using nothing but lies and fake legal documents. The community gossip network was working exactly as she'd planned, spreading her poison faster than I could possibly counteract it. The isolation started immediately, and it was brutal in that small town way that makes you feel like you're living in a fishbowl. The grocery store clerk who used to make small talk suddenly couldn't make eye contact. The gas station attendant pretended to be busy with paperwork when I walked in. Even the lady at the post office handed me my mail without a word and turned away before I could say thank you. Diane had painted me as a dangerous outsider, and apparently that was all it took to make me persona non grata in a place where I had been welcomed just a week ago. That evening I called my family attorney Harrison, and I could hear the concern in his voice as I described what was happening. Send me photos of everything, he said immediately. The pink paper, the violation notice, any emails you've received. Logan, if someone is creating fake legal documents and using them to demand money, that's not just harassment, that's criminal fraud, and it's a felony in most states. The gravity in his voice made me realize that this wasn't just about hunting rights anymore. This was about someone actively trying to steal money from me using fake legal documents. After hanging up with Harrison, I decided to do some detective work of my own. I went back to that storage room and really dug into the boxes my uncle had left behind. Buried underneath a stack of fishing licenses, I found a leather portfolio that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside were surveying maps of the entire area, legal documents with official seals and correspondence between my uncle and various government agencies. One survey in particular caught my attention because it showed not just my cabin and the immediate surrounding forest, but the entire lake and a huge swath of land that extended way beyond what I thought my property lines were. The date on the survey was from 1972, decades before the HOA community was even built. There were notes in my uncle's handwriting in the margins, things like retained rights and covenant enforcement, that didn't mean much to me at the time. But something about the way those survey lines were drawn made me think that maybe, just maybe, Diane had picked a fight with the wrong person. Harrison's voice had carried this strange excitement when he mentioned fraud, like he knew something I didn't. I was about to discover he meant way more than just fake fines. The documents in that leather portfolio weren't just property records. They were the keys to a kingdom that Diane never knew existed. The next morning I called Harrison back and described what I'd found in that leather portfolio. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, his voice had this edge of excitement that lawyers get when they smell a big win coming. Logan, I need you to scan every single document in that portfolio and email them to me immediately. Don't leave anything out, even if it looks unimportant. When I asked him why he sounded so interested, he dropped a bombshell that changed everything. When you bought Arthur's property, you didn't just get the cabin and hunting grounds. According to what you're describing, Arthur retained mineral rights, water access, and something called Covenant Enforcement Authority over the entire development when he sold the other lots. I had to ask him to repeat that because it sounded too good to be true. Harrison explained it to me like I was 5 years old, which honestly I needed at that point. Your uncle was the original landowner of all that property, Logan. When developers wanted to build the HOA community, they had to buy the land from him. But Arthur was smart. He sold them the lots, but kept certain rights for himself, including the right to enforce the original covenant terms on any future development. The implications of what he was saying started to sink in. Diane wasn't just harassing a random property owner. She was harassing the one person who might actually have legal authority over her entire community. Logan, if what I think is true, you don't just own your cabin. You might have veto power over their entire HOA charter. That's when I decided it was time to stop playing defense and start fighting back. The thought of having actual legal power over the woman who had been trying to destroy my life filled me with a satisfaction that was almost overwhelming. Harrison's excitement was contagious, and I could feel the tide of this battle shifting in my favor. The hunter was about to become the predator, and Diane had no idea what was coming her way. This wasn't just about defending my property anymore. This was about total victory. Following Harrison's advice, I drove into town and hired a professional surveying crew to come out and establish the exact boundaries of my property. But I didn't just want them to survey my cabin lot. I wanted them to survey everything that was described in those old documents from 1972. The surveying crew showed up the next day with their equipment truck and enough gear to map half the county. When I explained what I wanted, the lead surveyor looked at the old documents and whistled. "Sir, if these property descriptions are accurate, you're talking about surveying several hundred acres, including most of the lake, and a good portion of the surrounding forest." That's exactly what I wanted to hear. I told them to get started immediately and to mark everything with the brightest survey stakes they had. The visual impact was immediate and absolutely perfect. Bright pink ribbon stakes started appearing all around the HOA community, not just around my cabin. The surveying crew worked methodically using GPS equipment and laser measuring tools to establish exactly where my property lines were, according to those 1972 documents. By noon, there were pink ribbons fluttering from trees all along the main road that led into the community. By afternoon, the stakes had spread to include the community boat launch, the shared beach area that residents used for swimming, and even parts of some people's backyards. Residents started coming out of their houses in bathrobes and slippers, watching the surveying crew with growing alarm as more and more pink ribbons appeared in places they had always considered community property. The surveying crew was professional and efficient, but they weren't quiet about their work. Their equipment truck was parked right at the entrance to the community, and they had official permits and police escorts that made it clear this wasn't some amateur operation. When concerned residents approached them asking what was going on, the surveyors politely referred them to me as the property owner who had commissioned the work. The panic in their voices was music to my ears. I made sure to be visible during the whole process, standing near the surveying truck in my hunting gear, arms crossed, watching the pink ribbons multiply like flowers after a spring rain. The message was clear. The hunter they had tried to intimidate wasn't backing down. He was marking his territory. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using the same bright pink color as Diane's ridiculous violation notice, except this time the pink represented real legal authority, backed by decades of official documentation. Every stake in the ground was a declaration of war, and I was winning every battle before it even started. Around 2 in the afternoon, Diane came roaring up in her golf cart, but this time she wasn't alone. Her husband Gary was with her, a soft-looking guy in his 50s who seemed like he'd rather be anywhere else. They parked at the edge of the surveying area, and I watched Diane's face turn red as she counted the pink ribbons that now surrounded her perfect little community. She marched over to me with Gary trailing behind, and I could see her hands shaking with rage. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, pointing at the survey stakes like they were personally offensive to her. "You can't just put stakes on community property. This is harassment." I looked at her calmly and said, "Ma'am, I'm just establishing my property boundaries according to the legal surveys. Everything being marked belongs to me according to the county records." That's when Gary stepped forward, and for the first time I got a good look at Diane's husband. He seemed nervous, constantly looking around like he expected trouble, and when he spoke, his voice had this pleading quality that suggested he knew his wife had gotten them into something they couldn't handle. "Look, maybe we can work something out," he said, glancing between me and the surveying crew. "There's got to be some kind of misunderstanding here. Nobody wants any trouble." His desperation was palpable and pathetic, but Diane cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. "There's no misunderstanding, Gary. This person is trying to intimidate us with fake legal threats." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of the survey stakes, muttering something about documenting harassment and calling our lawyer. What would you do with evidence like this? Document everything first or confront them immediately? I've dealt with similar property disputes before, but as a professional hunter dealing with anti-hunting harassment, this felt personal in a way that made my hands shake. Watching Diane document my survey stakes like they were evidence of a crime was almost funny, except I knew she was deadly serious about trying to destroy my reputation in this community. The surveying crew finished their work around 4 p.m., and as they packed up their equipment, the lead surveyor handed me a folder with official documentation of everything they'd measured. "Mr. Logan, according to these original property descriptions, you own approximately 400 acres, including the entire lake and most of the forest surrounding this community." Walking back to my cabin that evening, surrounded by pink ribbons that marked the boundaries of my kingdom, I felt like I was holding dynamite while Diane was still playing with firecrackers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that cornered predators are most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. The real battle was just beginning. 3 days after the surveying crew finished their work, I got an email that made my stomach drop. The subject line read, "Emergency Community Safety Meeting," and it was signed by Diane as HOA president. "All residents are strongly encouraged to attend this urgent meeting regarding recent safety violations and property disputes that threaten our community values." The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community center, and something about the formal language told me this wasn't going to be a friendly discussion. I mean, when someone uses phrases like strongly encouraged and community values, you know they're planning something, but honestly, after everything that had happened, I was curious to see what kind of show Diane was going to put on. The room fell deathly silent when I walked in. 30 pairs of eyes all fixed on me like I was a criminal. Diane's supporters crowded the front, and I was about to face an uphill battle that I wasn't sure I could win. She'd arranged the seating so that all her supporters were sitting in the front rows, creating this wall of hostile faces that I'd have to walk past to find a seat. The whole setup felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Diane was standing at the front of the room, behind a podium shuffling through papers like she was preparing to deliver some kind of prosecutor's closing argument. Diane's voice dripped with feigned concern as she launched into a tirade turning the entire room against me. "Some people just can't respect the harmony we've worked so hard for," she said, her eyes flashing toward me. The room murmured in agreement. Property inheritance comes with community responsibilities. She began, her voice carrying that perfect blend of authority and concern that politicians use when they want to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things. Some individuals believe personal desires supersede neighborhood harmony, but we must remember that our community was built on shared values and mutual respect. She never mentioned my name directly, which was smart, but every few sentences she'd gesture in my direction. But here's where things got really interesting. Diane unveiled a petition that she claimed had been signed by 18 residents requesting that the town council establish public easement rights for what she called historically significant lake access. She held up this thick folder of papers and announced that the petition had already been submitted to the town planning committee with a hearing scheduled for next month. "We're asking municipal authorities to intervene when private property rights conflict with established community access patterns," she said. And the way she phrased it made it sound like I was some kind of selfish monster trying to steal the lake from poor defenseless families. I felt genuine pressure for the first time since this whole thing started. I stood up slowly, my voice steady as I met Diane's glare. "Before you make your accusations, let's verify the property lines, shall we?" The silence that followed was thick, and I knew I had their attention. I kept my voice calm and reasonable as I continued. "Before any municipal petitions move forward, shouldn't we verify the original property boundaries? Some of those old surveys from when Arthur sold the development lots might be relevant here." The room erupted in whispers, some residents clearly rattled by the mention of the original property rights. Diane's confident smile faltered as people started questioning her claims. I saw doubt begin to creep into their faces. An elderly resident in the front row, a guy who looked like he'd been around since the community was first built, suddenly perked up and said, "Wait, Arthur, that's the gentleman who sold us our lots decades ago. Didn't he keep certain rights as the original landowner?" That single question cracked Diane's composure like a hammer hitting glass. Her perfectly rehearsed presentation stumbled to a halt, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely rattled. "That's irrelevant ancient history," she said quickly, but her voice had lost that confident authority she'd been projecting all evening. "We're dealing with current community safety issues, not old paperwork from decades ago." But the damage was done. Other residents started murmuring among themselves, and I could see doubt creeping into faces that had been completely hostile just minutes before. Someone in the middle of the room called out, "What kind of rights did Arthur keep?" And another voice added, "Are we sure about the property boundaries we've been assuming all these years?" Diane tried to regain control of the meeting, but you could tell she was improvising now, instead of following her prepared script. "The petition has been submitted, and the legal process is already in motion," she announced, her voice getting sharper and more defensive. "Municipal authorities will determine the proper resolution of this dispute based on current zoning laws and community needs. Not on outdated documents that may not even be legally valid anymore," she continued. But even as she said it, I could see people exchanging glances and whispered conversations that suggested her certainty wasn't as contagious as it had been at the beginning of the meeting. The elderly resident who'd asked about Arthur was still frowning, like he was trying to remember something important that was just out of reach. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from unified hostility to uncertain confusion, and I could tell that Diane was losing control of the narrative she'd worked so hard to create. Her supporters were still with her, but the uncommitted residents were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. As I left the meeting, Diane's eyes followed me, filled with a venom I hadn't seen before. "This isn't over," she hissed. And for the first time, I wondered if I had truly just won, or if this was only the beginning. Walking out of that community center, I felt like I was balancing on a tightrope between victory and disaster. On one hand, mentioning Arthur's name had clearly shaken Diane's confidence and planted seeds of doubt in the minds of people who'd been ready to lynch me an hour earlier. On the other hand, she'd managed to escalate this dispute to the government level, which meant I was about to face legal battles that could drag on for months and cost thousands of dollars, even if I ultimately won. The next morning, I woke up with a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. I was done playing defense, done letting Diane control the narrative, and done pretending this was just a neighborhood dispute about hunting noise. It was time to show everyone exactly what they were dealing with. What Diane never suspected was this. When I bought my hunting cabin from Arthur's estate, I didn't just get the cabin and lake. According to the original covenant that Harrison had spent all night reviewing, I own the land underneath her entire Lakeside Vistas development, including veto power over their HOA charter. Arthur had been smarter than anyone realized when he sold those lots decades ago, and now his nephew was about to collect on a debt that nobody knew existed. I called the same surveying company that had done the boundary work, but this time I had a very different request. "I want you to mark every single property line I own according to the original 1972 covenant," I told them. "Not just around my cabin, but around the entire community perimeter. Use the brightest stakes you have, and make sure every single boundary marker is visible from the main road." The lead surveyor sounded concerned when he realized the scope of what I was asking for. "Sir, that's going to require a full crew working for 2 days, and the visual impact is going to be significant. Are you sure you want that kind of attention?" I told him that significant visual impact was exactly what I was paying for. By morning, every inch of land I legally owned, path, shoreline, even the HOA's prized garden entrance, was staked off with bright pink ribbon. It wasn't decoration, it was a declaration. A silent, screaming message. "You've crossed into my territory." The surveying crew had arrived at dawn with their equipment truck, followed by a second truck, loaded with hundreds of bright pink ribbon stakes. These weren't the subtle boundary markers you usually see for property surveys. These were industrial strength stakes with ribbons that looked like they could be seen from space. The crew worked systematically, starting at the main entrance to the community and working their way around the entire perimeter according to the property lines described in Arthur's original covenant. Some neighbors peeked through curtains. Others came outside staring at the lines crisscrossing their sidewalks and yards. Whispers turned into arguments. I'd stirred something, and not everyone liked what they saw. The surveying crew had official permits and a police escort, which made it clear that this wasn't some kind of vigilante operation. When concerned residents approached the surveyors asking what was happening, they were politely directed to contact me as the property owner who had commissioned the work. But I wasn't hiding in my cabin waiting for phone calls. I was standing right there at the community entrance, visible to everyone who drove in or out wearing my hunting gear, and watching the pink ribbons multiply with obvious satisfaction. The message couldn't have been clearer if I'd hired a skywriter. The hunter you tried to intimidate and harass wasn't just fighting back. He was marking his territory, and his territory included everything you thought belonged to your community. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using the same bright pink color as Diane's ridiculous violation notice, except this time the pink represented real legal authority, backed by decades of official documentation. Every stake in the ground was a declaration of war, and I was winning every battle before it even started. The visual transformation was absolutely stunning. Pink ribbons fluttered from trees all along the main community road, marked the boundaries of the shared beach area, surrounded the community boat launch, and even extended into parts of what some residents had thought were their own backyards. Around 2 in the afternoon, Diane came roaring up to the community entrance in her golf cart, with Gary riding shotgun and looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on Earth. She abandoned her cart and marched over to where I was standing, her face flushed red with rage and her perfectly styled hair starting to come loose from the stress. "You're destroying everything we've built here," she screamed, pointing at the pink ribbons like they were personally insulting to her. "This is harassment. This is intimidation. You can't just put stakes everywhere and claim you own community property." I didn't have to say much. The documents in my hands spoke louder than any threat. If they pushed further, I could shut down access to the lake, or the road, or the park they built partly on my land, and they knew it. That's when Harrison pulled up in his black sedan wearing a perfectly tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase that screamed expensive lawyer. He'd driven out from the city specifically for this confrontation, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. Harrison approached Gary, not Diane, which was a strategic choice that immediately established who the serious adults were in this conversation. "Mr. Gary," Harrison said in his professional attorney voice, "I have here legal documentation regarding covenant violations and criminal trespassing charges that have been occurring on my client's property." He handed Gary a thick packet of papers, while 30 neighbors watched from their front porches and driveways, some of whom had started recording the scene with their phones. Gary took the legal packet with hands that were visibly shaking, and when he opened it and saw the official letterhead and legal language, his face went completely white. "Diane," he said quietly, "we need to talk about this privately." Diane's face tightened like stone. Ethel didn't speak. Her fingers twitched at her clipboard like she wanted to strike something off, but had no authority left. They hadn't expected a counterattack this clean, this visible, this legal. But Diane was too far gone in her rage to listen to reason. "There's nothing to talk about," she shouted. "This is all fake legal threats designed to intimidate us. Our lawyer will tear this apart in court." Harrison smiled, the kind of calm professional smile that lawyers use when they know they're holding all the winning cards. "Mrs. Diane, you have exactly 48 hours to contact our office regarding covenant violations and criminal trespassing charges. After that, we'll be filing formal complaints with both the county prosecutor and the state attorney general's office." Those pink ribbons fluttering in the morning breeze looked like victory flags. The lines had been drawn, literally. But what I didn't know then was that while I drew borders, Diane was drawing up something else. A final move I never saw coming. Walking back to my cabin that evening, surrounded by pink ribbons that marked the boundaries of my kingdom, I felt like I was holding dynamite while Diane was still playing with firecrackers. But I couldn't shake the feeling that cornered predators are most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. I opened my mailbox and froze. A certified envelope from the county marked "Urgent" sat beside a notice pinned with a pink thumbtack. Diane had fired her final shot. 48 hours after Harrison delivered his ultimatum, my phone rang at exactly 9 a.m. It was Gary, and his voice sounded like he'd aged 10 years since our last confrontation. "Logan, we need to talk. Can you meet us at Harrison's office this afternoon? Diane and I have been discussing the situation, and we think there might be room for negotiation." The defeat in his voice was unmistakable, and I could hear Diane in the background, making sharp comments that Gary was clearly trying to ignore. Harrison's law office was one of those places that screams expensive legal power from the moment you walk in. Polished marble floors, mahogany furniture, and law books that probably cost more than most people's cars. Diane sat across the table flanked by a junior lawyer who wouldn't meet my eyes. I kept my hands folded, the surveyor's report in full view. Every shuffle of paper echoed like a gavel. Gary looked like a man who had been beaten down by weeks of stress and sleepless nights, slumped in his chair with his shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear. Diane sat rigidly upright, but there was something different about her eyes. Fear, real genuine fear. Harrison methodically laid out the evidence like a prosecutor presenting a murder case. Original survey documents from 1972 that established Arthur's ownership of the entire lake and surrounding forest. Copies of the covenant agreement that gave Arthur, and by extension me, veto power over any homeowners association formed on the property. Screenshots of Diane's email campaign that included fraudulent legal documents designed to extort money from me. Each piece of evidence slid across the polished conference table with quiet authority, and I watched Gary's face get paler with every document. Diane tried to maintain her defiant expression, but even she couldn't hide her growing realization that they were completely outgunned. The nuclear option came last, and Harrison delivered it with the calm precision of a surgeon making a critical incision. Article 7 of Arthur's original covenant grants the current owner of the primary lot, that's Logan, absolute authority to dissolve any homeowners association formed on covenant lands with written notice to the county clerk. He placed a single sheet of paper in front of Diane, and I could see her reading the same sentence over and over like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. This means Logan can legally dissolve your entire HOA with his signature on this document. The color drained from Diane's face so fast, I thought she might actually faint right there in the conference room. Gary was the first to break, and when he did, it was like watching a dam collapse. "We'll pay whatever you want," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Property damage, legal fees, whatever compensation you think is fair. Just please don't destroy our community." Diane shot him a look that could have melted steel, but Gary was past caring about her disapproval. "Diane, we're beaten. This man owns our entire neighborhood, and we've been harassing him for weeks." Her voice was hoarse, her signature shaky. For someone who had once ruled with impunity, even her silence now felt like surrender. That's when Diane finally understood that her reign of terror was over. The settlement terms were harsh but fair, and Harrison read them aloud like a judge delivering a sentence. "Mrs. Diane will immediately resign from the HOA presidency and surrender all association records and authority. Mr. Gary will pay $2,000 for property damage and trespassing violations. An additional $500 fine will be paid under state harassment statutes for the fraudulent legal documents. A mandatory public apology will be published in the community newsletter, acknowledging that all actions taken against Logan were inappropriate and legally baseless." Diane's pen shook as she signed each document, and Gary's signature was barely legible through his trembling hands. As I walked out of the law office, I passed by Diane's BM. Someone had tied a pink ribbon to her antenna. I didn't stop walking. In the parking lot, I encountered Diane and Gary standing beside their car, looking lost and disoriented like refugees from their own lives. No words were exchanged, but the weight of their defeat hung in the afternoon air like smoke from a dying fire. Diane couldn't even make eye contact, and Gary just stared at the ground with the expression of a man who'd finally realized how badly his wife had miscalculated their position. Within 30 days, a for sale sign appeared in Diane's front yard. That settlement money funded the construction of a beautiful cedar dock extending deep into my lake, and every sunrise brings the same coffee ritual I'd established that first morning before this whole mess started. I sit on wooden planks that extend over water that legally belongs to me, watching mist rise from the surface while loons call across the lake that Diane had tried to claim as community property. Those professional survey stakes with pink ribbons remain planted throughout the neighborhood as daily reminders of property boundaries and legal authority. Diane didn't lose because I outsmarted her. She lost because she believed power was permanent. But up here by this lake, nothing is permanent. Not the silence, not the seasons, and certainly not control. Confronting that bully revealed aspects of myself I never knew existed. I'm still the same professional hunter who values quiet mornings and clean shots, but now I understand the difference between backing down from conflict and strategically choosing your battles. The next time someone attempts intimidation through fake authority, I'll remember this encounter and the lesson it taught me about the power of legal preparation and patient counterattack. Sometimes the quiet hunter possesses the most powerful ammunition, and mine happened to be a century-old covenant that transformed Diane's kingdom into her personal nightmare. Looking back, she provided an unexpected gift by forcing me to discover not just my true property rights, but the version of myself that never backs down when pushed beyond reasonable limits. And maybe that's what lingers most. Not the fines, not the pink ribbons, not even the courtroom stares. It's that flicker of clarity when you realize someone tried to erase your legacy with a clipboard and failed. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't bang on doors. I just opened some old files, drew some lines in the dirt, and watched the illusion crumble. Maybe the real lesson here is, silence doesn't mean surrender, it just means we're aiming. If you stuck with me till now, I'd love to hear how you would have handled it. Thanks for writing this one out with me.
You've just experienced another crazy moment with QA Stories. Subscribe now and dive into even more chaos, laughs, and jaw-dropping tales.